Let's dive straight in, Kate. What's your first tip for us today?
Well, my tips are along the theme of retrieval practice, something I'm interested in as are you. My first tip is about knowing when not to do retrieval practice, so when to do review instead. So that might sound surprising to a few people that I'm saying there's actually some points where we shouldn't do retrieval practice.
Wow, you've hooked me straight in there, right? So tell me about this then.
Okay, well, I think I'll need to give a little bit of context, and something that you and I have in common is that we are super fans of Professors Robert and Elizabeth Bjork. So I'm going to just, draw on their work. So previously, well, actually in 1914, Edward Thorndike published The Law of Use and Disuse. And this was accepted in the community of academic field and memory. And what Thorndike said was that if you have information in long-term memory, but if you don't use it, you lose it. And I'm paraphrasing there. No, that's not a direct quote. So the idea is he was saying that it decays and it disappears. And actually that seems to make sense, and we can understand why it was accepted, and most people believe that's how memory works. However, and this is where the Bjorks come along, so they actually challenged Thorndike's law of disuse with the new theory of disuse, and this was in the 90s. But I can't believe that it was in the 90s, and I didn't know about it when I was training to be a teacher in 2010. So the new theory of disuse, for anyone not familiar with it, it doesn't say that what Thorndike says. It doesn't say that memories decay. It actually has two measures of memory with storage strength and retrieval strength. So the Bjorks argue that if it has transferred to long-term memory, that it will stay there. It just becomes difficult to access. So storage strength refers to how well embedded, entrenched information is in long-term memory. Now, storage strength can't decline, or rather the only way that it would decline would be with physical and quite extreme damage to the brain. So in a classroom context, because we're not dealing with that, in a classroom context we can be quite confident that storage strength doesn't decline. It can increase. So if it's transferred to long-term memory, it will be there. However, and this is where people go, but why do I forget things? Well, that's because of retrieval strength. And retrieval strength can and does fluctuate. It can decrease and it can increase. So, and I see this all the time when I've been observing lessons recently, and a teacher asked a question and a student's hand shot up in the air and they answered it correctly so quickly. And I thought, oh, their retrieval strength is high, because that's what retrieval strength is when it's high, that you can recall information quickly, correctly, and confidently. But when retrieval strength is low, we've all experienced this, students have experienced this, it's that frustrating feeling, oh, I know this, and it takes a long time, and it's quite slow and difficult to recall, or perhaps you don't recall it in that moment. And this is why I think it's essential for teachers to know, because we could be doing a retrieval task with students and they don't recall the information, and then an assumption is made that it wasn't encoded, it didn't transfer to long-term memory, was actually, it's probably there, it's just that the retrieval strength is low. But don't panic, because we can boost and increase the retrieval strength. And the way that we do that is either through review and a refresher, or through more retrieval practice. So the reason that I'm saying to teachers retrieval practice perhaps isn't always the best option is because there will be points in the academic year or in terms of your teaching where retrieval strength will likely be very low. So if we ask students to complete a retrieval practice task when retrieval strength is low, they won't do very well. And that's not good for them because they won't have retrieval success. It can be really demoralising, knock their confidence. It probably won't be that insightful for the teacher, and the teacher could misunderstand that data and think I need to reteach it. Whereas actually, if they'd have done a refresher or a review instead of a retrieval task, that would have boosted their retrieval strength. And then perhaps the following week they could do a retrieval task and they would do better. So it's really about understanding retrieval strength and storage strength. And by me saying don't do retrieval practice, do retrieval practice. It's a great strategy, but there are certain points where it's not the best strategy to use. So does that all make sense?
That's brilliant, Kate. So the first thing to say there is that's one of the best summaries I've heard of the retrieval storage strength difference, and the history from the Bjork's perspective was fascinating. Three things I want to dig into as a result of that, if that's okay. So the first is the obvious question, and that is how do we know? How do we know when it's a good time to do retrieval practice versus a bad time? What are some of the strategies that we can employ to know whether it's a good time to do retrieval practice?
Well, that's a great question, and we can actually know when the times are that we should use retrieval practice and we shouldn't. So I'm going to drop a few names here. Robert Bjork, Dylan William and I co-authored an article, and we wrote it in the August for teachers going back to school in September. And that's a classic example. Students have had a long break of 6 weeks, and we'll assume they haven't been studying like they would in school, so we can assume retrieval strength is low. So if you've got a year 11 class or a year 13 class, a class that you're carrying on with, it could be tempting to start the year, what can you remember from last academic year? And that won't turn out well, probably because of the retrieval strength being low. So in terms of the academic calendar, we can look at that. We can look at points where there's been a break in learning. So after the Easter holidays, possibly, although that does depend. If you've taught something right on the edge and they've had 2 weeks, then possibly you could do a retrieval practice task. But if they don't do as well as anticipated, it could be because retrieval strength is low. Another point to think about is when the content was last revisited or taught. So, and you know who else must need to know about this? Our Ofsted inspectors. And I don't know if they do, but the reason I say this is because lots of primary school teachers have told me that Ofsted inspectors are asking students questions about previously taught material. But actually, they really need to be aware of retrieval strength here, because if they were to ask a Year 6 student a question about something on the Year 4 curriculum, the Year 6 student might just panic, be blank, and the retrieval strength could be low. The best way for an Ofsted, and I know this is tips for teachers, not tips for Ofsted, but this can be helpful for teachers to say in an inspection. The best thing for an inspector to do would be able to talk to the classroom teacher. And if, for example, the class in Year 6 are studying plants, and they studied that in Year 4, then the Ofsted inspector can ask them questions about the curriculum content from Year 4, because the teacher should have revisited that, quizzed that, built on that, and the retrieval strength will be high. So it's so important for this in terms of understanding learning and especially making judgments as well. So the things that we need to consider are when there's been breaks and gaps with learning, but also if you haven't revisited something in a very long time, and I'm talking here months or it could even be years, then retrieval strength could likely be very low. But there are lots of variables with that. How well that information was taught, how thorough, for example, because you could ask a student a multiplication question that they've done years ago, but that will be really strongly embedded and entrenched, meaning that the retrieval strength is still high and accessible. But I often see there's a version of my retrieval grid, and my retrieval grid I created in history, but I think it works best in maths, where it's last lesson, last week, last term, and so on. And sometimes there's a last year question. And my only concern about that last year question is, have you revisited that since a year ago? Because if not, be very mindful the retrieval strength could be low.
This is fascinating, this, Kate. My second question for this, and this may be a really silly question, so please forgive me. What's the difference between a retrieval kind of opportunity or task versus a review task?
Yes, and it's not a silly question. Honestly, you ask all the great questions, and I've felt like that before when I've reached out to people like Robert Bjork. I said sorry, but that's a good question, and I'll give you an example of a review or refresher. So we're coming back to school after a long break. Why don't you review a knowledge organiser? Get it up on the board, have a question and answer discussion, talk about it in pairs, or do a refresher task, which could be comprehension based, reading the textbook, answering questions. The main difference is that there is support there, and that they have the knowledge organiser, the class notes, the textbook. They can talk about it, they can confer, the teacher can answer and ask questions, in contrast to retrieval, where you would take away that support. So does that answer your question?
That does, yeah, and I think you alluded to this earlier. So it is a good idea if something hasn't been revisited in a long time, do one of these review or refresher tasks, but then maybe a week later or something, then you follow it up with the appropriate retrieval task. Is that right?
Yes, and I would tell my students that, and I would be really explicit and say, you haven't done this in a very long time, so I'm not going to quiz you because I know that it will take you a long time. And I had a student, a sixth form student, come to me and say, Miss, I tried one of your brain dumps, without my idea, where I write everything down from memory, and I really struggled. I couldn't write much. I said, well, what were you writing about? And he was starting at the beginning of the course, something from a year ago. And I said, that's where you're going wrong. You should have read the textbook again, perhaps made some notes and wrote some questions, then waited, and then that will boost your knowledge and your confidence. And he did that, and it worked. Honestly, can you imagine going to a quiz with me, Craig, and I say, I know it, it's just my retrieval strength is low. That's how I see the world now.
It's brilliant, this, Kate. Well, that leads me to just a couple more follow-ups on this, if this is all right. You've touched upon one there. That's how much do you think it's important that the kids are aware of this? Because I'm of the opinion these days that for many years I've made the mistake of almost kind of keeping the kids in the dark of some of the ideas and strategies I've been trying. But this feels like something really useful for kids to be aware of, this difference between retrieval strength, storage strength, and not to panic if they think they've forgotten something. Would that be something you'd share with the kids?
Absolutely essential. I've shared it with my students, with parents. Parents and carers really need to know this, because even when they know that retrieval practice is more effective than highlighting and underlining, they can still panic when their child forgets and can't recall information. And that's where they need to have that deeper understanding of forgetting, that actually it's there, it's just not accessible at that moment in time. But don't worry, we can do something about that. And actually, it's really powerful when you know that. And it's really powerful when you know where the gaps are in your knowledge, because you can do something about that. So all the students that I've taught in recent years and their families, retrieval practice is just part of the language of learning. And I do use the term retrieval practice. And I will say retrieval strength as well. And I try and use it at every opportunity in lessons, on reports and parents' evenings. I mean, obviously, I'm the woman who wrote a book about retrieval practice, but it's really important that it comes from everyone, that all teachers and school leaders are all singing from the same retrieval practice hymn sheet and sharing that with students. And I'm working with primaries, and they're doing a great job of child-friendly explanations. And I just think the younger that they can understand this, the better.
Final question on this tip, and this may be a terrible question, again, Kate. How do we know whether retrieval practice is just really low versus kids just don't know it? It's kind of just not in there at all. Because you could almost feel as a teacher, all right, they didn't get that, they don't know the answer to that. Oh, it's okay, it's just because retrieval practice is low. Versus actually, they just don't have a clue what's going on. How do we make that distinction?
Yeah, again, a great question. And there's also other things about how do we know if they're just not trying, because retrieval practice is low stakes or no stakes. So there are things that we can do. And I do think, first of all, retrieval practice should have some level of accountability, so that if a student isn't trying, isn't investing effort, the teacher can have that conversation and say, I've noticed this. Now, in terms of whether they just don't know it and they never got it the first time round, or retrieval strength is low, what we can do, and this is where retrieval practice is also brilliant, and I'll talk about this in another tip as well, about retrieval cues, is that we can increase the retrieval cues and prompts. And if that is still not helping students to reach the correct information, then that is a real clear indicator that it's worth revisiting, going over it in that review and that refresher, and that you recognised this gap in knowledge. But if they can get it, so teachers are so good at this, without realising, they'll be walking around a class and they'll see a student struggling, and they'll just give a verbal prompt or just a little hint to get them going, and they go, oh, that's what I meant to be writing about. And then they do that. But still after that verbal prompt, blank, they're struggling, that's when we know as a teacher, okay, this is something I need to revisit.